surprised at how Afro-Cubans and Cubans in general really value their language, their culture, and their history, particularly in terms of dance and music. I think Havana alone has 5 museums that are devoted just to dance. I mean, 5 individual buildings devoted just to dance. They love ballet, they love all sorts of dance. And as part of my experience down there, I learned about so many different music styles, so many different rhythms and dance styles that are the foundation of salsa. And I had been dancing for some time. And I said, if I hadn't heard about any of this, and I didn't know about any of this, that means there are a lot of people who probably don't know about it. A lot of the textbooks that are written about this and a lot of the articles are in Spanish, rather. So it really would be helpful to be able to make that transition and make it accessible to primarily English-speaking dancers and musicians. So that's how it got started. It was an inspiration from working with teachers in Havana and in other parts of Cuba. And I've gone back several times. And so that's why Salsa Roots existed. Plus, I had the good fortune of meeting a number of musicians in this area who've been teaching the history of salsa for some time. But at the particular time that I went to Cuba, those classes weren't happening. And I said, if their classes had been on board, I would have just gone to the classes, and that would have been the end of it. But since they weren't there, I did a lot of personal research and put things together. And I wanted to make something a little bit different that really focused more on the dance styles and not specifically the music, because there's been a lot written about the music, but really understanding the dance from the inside and getting people interested in that and learning those different dance styles. That's really, that was my main mission.
So what actually is salsaroots.com then?
SalsaRoots.com is really devoted to the history of the dance and music styles that are the foundation of what we call salsa right now. And salsa is sort of an umbrella term for a lot of Latin rhythms. A lot of them came from Puerto Rico, a lot of them came from Cuba. But the other thing I've noticed as I've tried other different American dance styles, there's been a significant contribution from the United States in terms of how salsa is danced right now. So the site has a lot of different parts to it. There are articles, there are interviews with local musicians and dancers, there's links to other websites, and there are recommendations about videos and music and other internet sites that people can really go to for more information. But the core of it is really a summary and description of dance styles from Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the United States that are the foundation of salsa.
So we have a group of people who just bought their first salsa video. They're learning how to salsa dance. There's probably a very loaded question, but what is the history of salsa?
Well, that is a very loaded question because lots of people have opinions about even the name. What does the word salsa mean? And one of really the premier historians in this area, Max Salazar, allowed me to reprint an article that he wrote about where the word salsa actually came from. I mean, there's some people that even say that the word was first used in terms of understanding and explaining this type of contemporary dance music. They were used by DJs in the West Coast, which most people won't agree with, but that's one perspective. The other thing about salsa is in terms of the music, since that's the foundation, a lot of the rhythms came specifically from Cuba by way of, or Africa, to Cuba and how they got transformed there. There are also specific music and dance styles from Puerto Rico that we can say are sort of the foundation of what we're looking at in terms of salsa. From Cuba, there's at least 8 or 10 different contemporary and folkloric dance styles that we know are sort of the basis of salsa. Some of the most well-known ones include son, danzón, guaguancó, and mambo. Now, son we know, or most people will agree that son is probably the music and the structural foundation for what we call salsa right now. It was developed in the late 1800s in the eastern part of Cuba, in the hills, what's called the Oriente part of Cuba. There are cities like Santiago that are in that area. And as people were working in those rural fields, they needed to find ways to express themselves, to relax, and to party. And a lot of music actually came out of Oriente province. Many of the Afro-Cubans who were there continued to reinforce and preserve rhythmic structures that came from Cuba. Because unlike the United States, the slaves that were brought over to Cuba were allowed to maintain their connection with their original culture. They brought over the same drum patterns. They stayed in the same sort of tribal groups that they actually had in Africa, so they were able to maintain that heritage. So as people were sort of adjusting to their new life in Cuba, and they partied, the drum rhythms came out of that. And son was initially primarily percussion, but other instruments were really added to that. It's a very sort of earthy, very spiritual sort of connection that comes out of song. And that's also expressed in the way people dance. When people dance son, it's a very simple dance compared to what we look at as salsa. But it was unusual because the man and the woman were really facing each other in a very intimate embrace. They were very close to each other. And their body movements were extremely flirtatious and sensual. The things that people think of in terms of Cuban dance movements, contra body movement, where the torso and the hips are swaying back and forth. A lot of that basic structure and feel actually comes from song. There are also some very basic turns that you'll see in salsa originated in song. The music, a lot of people have probably heard of before because that's the music that was featured in Buena Vista Social Club. That's again really brought people back to understanding and appreciating the music that came from that time. Now another influence that came around the same time, in maybe 1870s, 1880s, is dansson. And dansson is very different than song. As I was looking more into where these dance styles and rhythms came from, I became aware of the number of immigrant groups that have come to Cuba over the years. Because you traditionally think of the Spanish influence and you think of the African influence. But there's also a large influence from France and Haiti. So as it turned out, not long after the Haitian Revolution, the Haitian rich people and their slaves, as they were kicked out of Haiti, they came to Cuba. And they brought very specific music and dance styles that evolved and changed as they came to Cuba. Dansson, for instance, we believe has its roots in contradance and danza, which are really more formal French court dances that have a percussion end to it that has that kind of Cuban flavor. But it doesn't have that kind of driving percussive rhythm that we traditionally think of in Cuban music. It's a lot lighter, it's airier. It's performed by bands that were called charanga bands that had a lot of flutes and violins. So it has a much more refined and elegant feel. And even the dance it's a little bit stiffer, posture's a little bit more upright, and there are a lot of rules and structure in how dansson is actually danced. It became incredibly popular not only in Cuba but also in Mexico. Veracruz, which is very close to Cuba, also has its version of dansson. So it's in a way it's sort of romantic and mournful and a little elegant, much more restrained than that kind of earthy feel that one gets from song. Now back to another sort of earthier feel of Cuban styling comes from guaguancó, which is one of the many forms of rumba. Guaguancó is a lot of fun, and you'll see elements of guaguancó in how contemporary salsa dancers dance, because that's a dance where people break away from each other. They're not directly necessarily connected to each other, but they're responding to each other's body movements. The man is flirting with the woman is flirting with the man. They get to do a lot of freestyle dancing, but always within the structure of what's happening in the music and listening very carefully to what's happening within the rhythm section of the salsa band or the rumba band. And rumba, again, started among the poorer blacks with very few instruments, started initially with percussion and not always drums. We're talking boxes, packing crates off the docks. That's how people would actually relax. And guaguancó is one of those dances where if you've ever seen Cubans dance that, you'll say, gosh, I've done those moves. I've seen those moves on the salsa floor and I didn't really recognize that. Now, one of the other forms of Cuban dancing is mambo. A lot of people have heard of mambo, but Cuban mambo does not look like what we think of as mambo. Mambo became extremely popular as a big band, instrumental, huge sound, probably in the 50s. Became very popular in Cuba, came to Mexico where it took off like mad. Perez Prado became an international success because of his promotion of mambo, and then it eventually got to the United States. Now, what I've learned by talking with some people in Cuba is mambo was one of the few popular dances that actually started as a form of performance. It was actually choreographed to be done in nightclubs. Most of the other dances developed in the streets and developed among The common people, they weren't really choreographed dancers, but mambo actually started as a choreographed dance. Now, of course, when mambo got to the United States, people loved the music, but they changed the dance style a little bit. So that's, again, the rhythmic structure of mambo, the high energy, the huge sound of mambo comes from Cuba, but the United States also contributed in terms of styling. Cannot leave out Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico needs to get equal time. One of the major influences in terms of current day salsa is a dance style and a rhythm called bomba. Again, there's a lot of African influence in bomba. It's driven primarily by these huge drums, very different than conga drums. The drums out of Puerto Rico are shorter, they're fatter, and they have this kind of chilling, very emotionally evocative feel to them. It feels as though they're really pulling for emotion and a rhythmic sense deep in your soul. And the people that dance bomba, very often you see a lot of women dancing bomba. Their body movements are directly in response to what's happening with the drummer. In fact, they actually, and the men, their body movements lead the drummer in his improvisation, so that if a man or a woman shakes their shoulder at a certain rhythm, the drummer will respond to that in the way that he plays. Again, so you have a certain amount of structure, but a lot of fun, a lot of improvisation, but everything very deeply rooted within the music.
So what we dance today, what we dance when we go out dancing either in San Francisco or New York, what are the contemporary roots of what we're dancing? How did it go from the dance forms we've talked about currently to what we're dancing today on the dance floor?
A lot of it depends on the music, and I think the music is very heavily influenced by New York and the big band sound. And people who are in New York back in the 50s, back in the 40s, were also exposed to ballroom dancing. They were exposed to swing dancing. If you look at salsa dancers, or in those days they called it Latin dance. They didn't have the particular names that we use now. But if you look at people dancing mambo or Latin, and you cut away to people dancing Lindy Hop, you'll see a lot of similarities. The ballroom styling also heavily influenced what we call salsa right now. Some of the more contemporary salsa styles that came from Cuba are things like casino or rueda, which is the circle dance, where the couples, there's several couples in a circle that actually change partners and have very specific steps that they do based on somebody who calls out. I sort of call it Cuban square dancing. So as the music changed, cha-cha-cha is another one that initially started in Cuba, but was heavily influenced by ballroom dancing when it came to the United States. So a lot of these dance styles became morphed and transformed as people were influenced by other dance styles. I mean, even going back to the 50s, you can look at people dancing mambo, but you can also see where they were doing the equivalent of break dancing. They were doing things that look like tap dancing on the floor in their freestyle. So salsa continues to evolve and change.
So what would you like to tell these beginning salsa dancers that we have, purchasing this video? What should they take out in their dancing from the history of the dance?
Respect the history and respect the music. That's the most important thing. Because the thing that I've noticed so much about dancers from Latin America is their comfort level with the rhythms, with the structure of the music that informs and they answer to what's happening in the music. They're not thinking about patterns that are going on in their heads. They're not necessarily counting, but they are so connected with the music, it looks absolutely effortless. Plus, it makes things a lot easier. You don't have to continue. Particularly if you're freestyle dancing, you can take a very simple step, and if you're dancing that in response to what's happening in the music, it looks spectacular. It looks flashy, but it's just that you're that connected with it. And another way that people can really get an understanding and appreciation for the history of salsa is to go to salsaroots.com. We happen to have a wonderful video that focuses in on a lot of dances from this particular video from Cuba. A lot of the dance styles from Cuba, so you can actually see the roots, the physical roots of those dances. Plus, we have recommendations for other videos that you can watch to get ideas and get inspired.
Wow, it sounds like we should tell people to have fun, to follow the music,
Always.
wherever it's going to take them. Thank you very much for doing this video. I think we've educated plenty of people out there on the history of salsa. And there's a lot more to learn, so please, everybody, visit salsaroots.com, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
That's one. No. Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. Now you've got the basic step going, and you're going forward and back, and the music cut out. What the hell is that?
Liquor and action.
Thank you for purchasing this video and staying with us all the way to the end. We hope you've enjoyed teaching and learning it as much as we've enjoyed teaching it. Thank you for purchasing. Thank you.
Liquor and action.
Holy
Shit. What's your health? Liquor and action.
Ready. And 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. Slide the hand. 1, 2, 3.
Oh, fuck.
Mm.
Go.
Let's rock
Liquor
and roll. Breaking it
and
down.
action.
Read it. Oh, no. Let's
Salsa dance.
Okay. And action.
Ooh, that music ended great, don't you think? All right.
Five, 6,
voice guide on. Stop. 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 Stop.
Stop.
Play. Stop. Stop. Play. Stop. Stop. Open. Stop. Stop.
So, you know, one hand, two to go. One hand, three to go. One hand, four to go. One hand, four to go.
Play. Stop. Stop. Play. Stop. Stop. Play. Stop. Stop. Play. Stop. Stop. Close.
Interesting. See you next video. Yeah. Sorry. Sell too.
Power off.
Interesting. Alright.